This is the Nerdy Romantics Podcast, and I'm your host, Y.M. Nelson. Hello, Nerdy Romantics. Today we're going to talk about Star Trek Season 3, the final season of Star Trek Picard. And what I really wanted to talk about ever since myself, my guest host Stacy, and my guest host Jen did the two regular episodes that we did about Star Trek Picard, I wanted to do an Easter egg episode because there were so many little takeaways that I wanted to share with you all. Some that just brought back episodes that I really loved, some that just harkened on things that, as a Trekkie and as a person who watched Star Trek The Next Generation and actually still watches it every now and then, more like every night, but as somebody who is a total fan of Star Trek TNG and some of the other franchises, there are a lot of Easter eggs in this final season that I picked up on, and that if you're a Trekkie, hopefully you picked up on as well. I'd also love to know some of the Easter eggs that you saw that maybe I didn't note here in this podcast episode. And I'd love to know what you were left with there, because for me, I was left with a feeling of completion for that series, a feeling of satisfaction that, okay, we saw them all together, and a feeling that I was respected. It's probably the best way to say it, that I was respected as a fan of the series. So let's get into some Easter eggs that I saw. A couple of these we did talk about in the regular episodes, the part 1 and part 2. But more so, we talked about a lot of the story and a lot of our favorite scenes and our character development and things like that. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, then please go back and listen to those episodes of Star Trek Picard, our review for Season 3. I've actually done a review for Season 1. I did a 2-part review. That's early on, episodes 4.1 and 4.2. And we also did a episode, might have been 2 episodes, but I think it was just one, on Star Trek Picard Season 2. So we've been following this series for as long as it's been out there, and it has been a joy to do that. So let's get into the Easter eggs. I did these kind of by episode as I saw them, and so hopefully you'll be able to follow along by episode as well. The first really big Easter egg in episode 1 that really got me giddy was the recorder that Picard had in The Next Generation. And that recorder is actually significant for a couple of reasons. It takes us back to that episode in Star Trek TNG that's called The Inner Light. And it is in Season 5, episode 25. So it's near the end of that season. It's an Easter egg for 2 reasons. One, because it takes you back to that episode. And in that episode, information gets infused in him for this race of people that are now extinct. And so in order for them to actually impart their history, they put their history in this probe and gives the person an interactive experience. So basically, Picard lived a whole life of this person in this society that is now extinct. The life was right before the planet's sun went supernova. He had a whole family. He had a wife, two kids, he had grandkids. And one of those kids was a son that they named Batai after a friend that had passed on. So his son was very into music. First learned to play the recorder and actually learned to play the recorder better than he did, which that was also a hobby of Picard's character that he was living through. Once they drug the probe into the Enterprise, and there was a recorder that was in that probe. That's why he still has that recorder on Star Trek Picard, because that was an actual physical thing that he got from that experience. But the second part of this Easter egg is that in this episode on TNG, The Inner Light, Batai, his son, he's constantly playing this melody over and over again. And so the melody that he plays is part of the theme song in seasons 1 and 2 of Star Trek Picard. So if you go back to season 1 of Star Trek Picard and season 2, you'll hear that melody that Ty is learning to play in the inner light. That was a mega Easter egg, if you will, for that episode. We're looking at him packing up. Him and Laris are packing up because they are headed to make a life for themselves somewhere else. Picard is actually in his office at his desk. So this is where we see the recorder first, but we also see a couple other things on his desk. And one other thing that we actually see is this big sculpture. And this is an Easter egg from a TNG episode where Picard is being pulled into this anthropological mystery. One of his old professors is actually trying to chase down and trying to get pieces of this anthropological puzzle. And he's getting pieces of code from an ancient civilization. So this episode is called The Chase. It's in season 6, episode 20. And The Chase is all about this anthropologist who Picard knows and is pulling together all these pieces from an ancient civilization. Picard gets pulled into it because there are people chasing this anthropologist because they want the pieces of the puzzle. And they end up killing him. So Picard actually gets on board to actually put these pieces of the puzzle together. As they put the puzzle together, it's a message from this ancient civilization basically saying that we have seeded other planets with our DNA. And so if you've all come together, then you're all related. These are humanoids that are at war with each other, that are all related and don't like each other. There's humans, Klingons, Dacians. They have all kind of gotten together trying to put this puzzle together. So the sculpture that you see on Picard's desk in Star Trek Picard is a gift that this anthropologist has given Picard. It is a sculpture where it's a bunch of people inside of one this person, and basically it says out of many one. And so it embodies the theme of that particular episode, The Chase, because in a sense that's what the lesson learned should be. But the lesson kind of falls on deaf ears for most of them. Also in episode 1, we see Daffy again. One small Easter egg here is that Daffy is actually listing some big events because they're trying to thwart this threat to a big event. And one of the big events that she mentions that's coming up is the Gratitude Festival, and that's an Easter egg that goes back to Deep Space Nine. The Gratitude Festival is a Bajoran spiritual holiday, and they have an episode on DS9 that kind of centers around the Gratitude Festival. And of course, there's some relationship stuff going on there between Reese, Kira, and Odo, and the Gratitude Festival. So let's go into episode 2. So episode 2, I have a couple that stand out here. I'm not sure exactly when they mentioned this, but they mentioned a repulsor beam. And I recall this because in episode 3 of TNG, in episode 3 is they go on to this other Starfleet ship that, and the people have all died because they've all frozen to death, and it's because they all basically inhaled this infection that was in the air that made them drunk and succumb to their inhibitions. So Wesley Crusher is working on a science project for class. He created a tractor beam on a small scale. So then he said this could work as a repulsor beam. And then he uses that same kind of algorithm that he uses for his science project on the Enterprise itself and saves them from being destroyed by an asteroid hitting them. And then we also meet Captain Sneed, I believe his name is, in episode 2. And it's interesting that Captain Sneed has a baseball because that was one of the big things for Captain Sisko in DS9. Captain Sisko was a baseball fan. He had a baseball on his desk. And it's symbolic in a few episodes. One episode where they are forced to leave DS9 because the Dominion has taken over. And Captain Sisko does not take his baseball with him. And he does that on purpose because he's letting the Cardassians and the Dominion know that he's coming back to DS9. So the episode right after Jadzia Dax dies, or in that episode, Captain Sisko is feeling like he cannot connect with anything. And he's going to go back to Earth, and he takes his baseball with him. Kira notices that he took the baseball because she said it means he's not coming back. That baseball and having that there that was symbolic on DS9 of Captain Sisko. It's like a symbol of his presence. In episode 4, I noted a few Easter eggs. First, the scene that they keep coming back to, where Admiral Picard is actually telling some young Starfleet Academy folks about kind of his adventures. And the second story, and he's talking about a very pivotal episode of TNG called Darmok. The Enterprise is meeting another race that they have not encountered before. And I think people have encountered them, but they cannot talk with them. It's because this race of people don't use verbs and they don't use I, the pronoun I. They don't have that sense of self in their language. On top of that, they're communicating with each other by using imagery from their own mythology. So Darmok was the person that met with somebody named Jalad. They met on an island in the ocean. They fought a beast. They were able to defeat that beast. They came separately to this island, but then they leave together. So the alien actually kidnaps Picard and takes him onto this planet, and he transports down as well because they have this mythology and this shared experience. they have to share an experience in order to understand the way that these people communicate. It's really amazing with this Darmok episode. It's one of those episodes that show that sci-fi goes past adventures, showing aliens and fun stuff and action to convey how human conditions and to look at how are we doing this as humans and how can we be better. And this is one of those episodes. TNG, for me, the human theme throughout that series was always about social change, societal change, how we look at each other in society, how we connect with each other, how we treat each other, and human rights. DS9 was always about faith and spirituality and war and how we deal with that because they were constantly at war, and the grounding of faith with the Bajoran people and with Captain Sisko being the emissary of those people. Voyager to me was always about the environment and showing us kind of how we were messing with the environment. And the other part of it had to do with American and foreign relations as well. Those are the themes of some of the big Star Trek. And in episode 4 of Star Trek Picard, he's talking about Darmok, which is one of those pivotal human condition kind of episodes that happened in TNG. Near the end of episode 4, where they were actually going into this nebula, it reminded me a lot of Farpoint, which is episode 1 and 2 of TNG. In that nebula, there were a lot of jellyfish looking creatures, which is the same kind of creatures that were being exploited in episodes 1 and 2 of TNG. They were creatures who could turn energy into matter, and one of them was being exploited on this planet, and they were calling it Farpoint Station. Also in episode 4, they're being did through an asteroid field, and that harkened back to this TNG episode where they have to direct themselves through an asteroid field that is charged, where they can't just warp out of that asteroid field. It's like a booby trap. It had brought in a very old, like centuries old ship called the Prometheus, by the way. So as they were kind of being directed through that asteroid field, it reminded me a lot of that particular episode. In episode 5, there are a lot of little reminders about past TNG episodes. So many that I didn't even write them down because there were so many. But one of the big ones is that we see at the end of episode 5, we see Rolaren. And this is a big Easter egg. Big, like huge. Especially for those who watch the end of TNG, because the last season is where we meet Rolaren. Rolaren is a Bajoran in Starfleet, and this is where we first meet the Bajorans, right? So she's a Bajoran in Starfleet who basically got court-martialed and kind of kicked out of Starfleet because of a disaster on this mission. She's kind of insubordinate and all this other surrounds her. And at first, Captain Picard did not want her on this particular mission. She's tasked to kind of be the intermediary between some outcast Bajorans. This is after the Bajoran Cardassian War. But there are these Bajorans that left Bajor and they went to other planets. So one of these factions is a radical faction, and so they wanted to they try to get this leader of this radical faction, and they task her to kind of come in and do that. Well, there's a reason why they task her, not just because she's Bajoran, but for some other reasons there as well. Everybody that's on the Enterprise is like, why Rolaren? We don't do things that could possibly get our people killed, which is what she's kind of accused of doing something on a mission that ended up in the death of one of the people that she was with on that away mission. And so they really didn't want to work with her. So Guinan vouched for her with Captain Picard, and because Captain Picard respects Guinan so much, Captain Picard takes Rolaren under his wing. By the end of the mission, he wants her to stay in Starfleet and on the Enterprise. She's a recurring character that season. Where we leave off with her character, so she ended up going off with the Maquis, and that really hurt Captain Picard because he was really seeing her as kind of a mentee, somebody he could help, who at first was counted out. And so to see her come back on Star Trek Picard is big. I mean, that's really big. And it's especially big because of the irreverent sacrificial way that she ended up in Star Trek Picard is interesting. After her character was ultimately redeemed in Picard's eyes at that point. Episode 6 is where we see Data for the first time. Data slash all of his personalities that's in him. And so there are a lot of Easter eggs there around where they go and they find Data. When they find Data, actually, when they go into that museum, it's a museum, essentially. It's covered in Star Trek as Easter eggs, period. Because one of the first things that we see in a section there, like close up almost in a zoo almost, is we see a tribble. And it's so funny because we see that tribble as Worf is walking by that display case with the tribble in it. The tribble is alive. And so the tribble is like making all this noise because Worf is walking by. Worf is a Klingon. Tribbles are lovely, they're wonderful, and everything like that, except when they're in the presence of Klingons. Because evidently there was something going on with Klingons and the tribble community or something, like they banned them or something like that. I don't know, something crazy. But basically this is an Easter egg from the original Star Trek. And this Easter egg, there's no way that you could have a Star Trek anything if you didn't have a tribble in it, because this particular little whatever, this little being is in just about every series and is mentioned in just about every series since this particular episode. And the tribble episode, it originates in the OG Star Trek. So it's a fun episode. It's a silly episode. It has been recreated in DS9. So in DS9, there is basically footage, and because they go back in time. So basically, they're putting themselves into that tribble episode from the OG Star Trek. When they go back in time, you also see not only just the tribble, the whole thing with tribbles, you also see that Jadzia Dax, who used to be Curzon Dax, you see the Klingons that Shazan Dax hung out with. And you kind of get that connection there. So if you're not an OG Star Trek fan, you even get more of a connection there. Because Kang is actually in a couple of OG Star Trek episodes, more than just the tribble one. And Koloff is in the tribble one. But you basically see the Klingons that Curzon Dax and Jadzia Dax, who used to be Curzon Dax in DS9. You see those Klingons, and those are the same actors, by the way, from each of those particular episodes. And there's a mentions of tribbles in Discovery. There's mentions of tribbles in Voyager. And there's of course a tribble here in the museum. Some other Easter eggs. These are all ones that surround Data because that's what they're going back there to find in this museum or in secured area fortress. They don't know it, but they are discovering that they are actually going back to find Data. And we see all of these Easter eggs that surround Data. We see a crow walking around. Of course, that crow has to do with Data when he gets dreams. The episode where he has unlocked his dream center. And there's Moriarty, which we talked about on the regular episode. Stacy was like, oh my gosh, we see Moriarty. We know Moriarty because Data loves Sherlock Holmes. And there's that one episode, of course, where he goes into the holodeck and Geordi misspeaks and Moriarty becomes Data's arch enemy. And not just Sherlock Holmes' arch enemy, but Data's arch enemy. And so Moriarty grows that holodeck and they have to contain him in a second episode. So Moriarty gets kind of a couple of different episodes in TNG, and to see that it's the same actor that played Moriarty for TNG. And it's funny because he's like acting as an AI and acting as like a holographic, don't go here kind of thing. He's like right before you get to Data, he's like the last ultimate guard there, which is so interesting that they do that. And later on in other episodes where they're trying to actually put Data together so he can actually help things, we see his cat Spot. His cat hated just about everybody except him. And I think and there was one other person that Spot did not hate. But yeah, nobody liked Spot except except Data. And then there was these other episodes surrounding Spot. That was in episode 8. I'm gonna jump into episode 8. So getting back to episode 7, episode 6, I should say, as we meet Data, there are a lot of Easter eggs that surround him. In episode 7 is when we meet Geordi, and Geordi is at a starship museum. So we are seeing the Defiant, which was from DS9. That was the ship that Captain Sisko commanded in the war. It was the first cloaked ship that the Federation had that was legally cloaked. There was another ship that was illegally cloaked in TNG, where the captain at the time, he became an admiral when we meet him on that TNG episode. But it was Riker's first command, and they were messing around with cloaking technology, which the Federation can't have cloaking technology because it is a part of the treaty with the Romulan ceasefire. So the Defiant has a Romulan cloaking device on it. We also see Voyager there. And as we know, Voyager did come back to Earth. But another thing about the Defiant, the Defiant was destroyed. And so then they gave Captain Sisko another ship. Defiant was destroyed in Dominion War. They gave Captain Sisko another ship, basically just like the Defiant. It was called something else. I can't remember what it was called. I wanted to say Valiant, but that's a whole different ship. The Valiant is a ship that some Starfleet Red Squad, that's a whole nother episode. But it was named something else briefly. Admiral Ross gave it to Captain Cisco, and then Captain Cisco was allowed to rename it. And of course, he renamed it to Defiant. But it's interesting how it's just that it was renamed to Defiant, but it's not like Defiant A, B, or C. Like Enterprise has Enterprise, then Enterprise A, B, C, D, E, F, you know. So that's interesting that that wasn't Defiant B or whatever, but I love how that happened. Also, we see who we think is Tuvok from Star Trek Voyager. We see Tuvok, but actually, we don't see Tuvok. We actually see a changeling. We meet the changelings in DS9 because Odo is a changeling. As that series goes on, that the Dominion is basically run by the changelings. And so the changelings don't like us. All right? They don't like us. Odo likes us, but the changelings are part of the Dominion, and we fought the Dominion in DS9. And so the changelings don't like us, but the changelings want to run things. So basically, that's kind of, where all of that comes from. In episode 8, some more data around in Easter eggs. We see Tasha Yar's hollow photo. Data had that hollow photo. That's a small thing that's also kind of a big deal because with Data not having feelings, we don't necessarily see Data as having a romantic relationship. But Data had an intimate relationship with Tasha Yar because he had an intimate moment with Tasha Yar in episode 3 of the TNG series. And she said at the end of that episode, and you think of it as a joke, right? She says at the end of that episode, we're not going to talk about this. They had basically a one night stand. She's like, we're not going to talk about this. And they go back to normal, but their relationship becomes more than just a one night stand. And when she dies, it really does affect him. And it affects him more than any other relationship that he has. There's one episode where in TNG where Data is put on trial in a sense. Is Data property, right? Because he's an android, and Bruce Maddox, this is where we first meet Bruce Maddox, who also is a major player in season 1 of Star Trek Picard. We first meet Bruce Maddox in an episode on TNG. He wants to study Data because he wants to make more Datas. He wants to have a whole race of Datas, maybe. And so we get into, is Data human? Well, Data's not human, but is Data a sentient being with autonomy, or is Data property? And before I kind of get off of the whole point, which is Easter eggs, because that episode is one of those, it's like Darmok, it's one of those human condition, civil rights kind of episodes. It's one of those episodes where even though you're looking at an android and you have an android on trial, this is really talking about the human condition. One of the things that Picard does is to show that Data is a sentient being and should have autonomy over his own life. He basically pulls out Data's momentum. And one of those things is a hollow photo of Tasha Yar. And that meant something to him because she meant something to him. And then later on in TNG, there's this episode where we meet Tasha Yar's sister. And so he has this real connection with her, but she's nothing like Tasha. But Data wanted to believe that Tasha Yar's sister was a lot like Tasha and that he was going to have kind of another Tasha presence in his life to fill that void, because that's what he says when friendships leave, there's a void. That's his definition of friendship, is that we get used to somebody, and when they're not there, we miss that person, that it creates a void in his life. But we do see in episode 8, because we are seeing Data kind of going through, and his personality and is mixed in with lore and mixed in with B4, and he's got all of this. He's got multiple personality disorder basically in episode 8 of Picard. And we see all of these remembrances coming back, and those remembrances are fending off Lore's personality, because these remembrances have more value in this being. And so Data is resurgent. He's coming back. And Tasha Yar's hollow photos, like I said before, we see Spot and that cat. And it's very interesting because he uses contractions and he uses humor in this particular episode. And that is an Easter egg in itself, because those were two things that Data could not do. He could not understand humor, and he could not wrap his mind around being funny in TNG, and also he couldn't use contractions in TNG. In episode 9, we get this massive Easter egg. We get to go back on the Enterprise D, which is the Enterprise from the next generation TNG. And they meant Enterprise E. And so we're going back on Enterprise D, but it's not really Enterprise D, because Enterprise D was destroyed, Enterprise E was destroyed, and I think we were on Enterprise F at the end of the movie, Star Trek movie installment, part 9. So they mentioned Enterprise D and they mentioned Enterprise E, but we are actually going back. They've recreated Enterprise D basically. Geordie's has redone the old Enterprise D. They have a whole moment, like all of them, when they go back on that bridge and they go in and Picard goes in the ready room and all this kind of stuff. They themselves have a moment, but the one big thing that Picard mentions, and I've always thought this as well, I'm like, he talks about the carpet. He's like, oh, the one thing that I miss is the carpet. And he's like looking around and he's showing us the carpet. And that is really essential and quintessential to Star Trek TNG. Is that Star Trek TNG is the Enterprise D is the only one that has carpet. None of the other Star Trek ships that are really prominently featured on Star Trek have carpet. None of them. That's the only one that does. And I've always thought that was like a big deal, but nobody else ever said anything about it. And the fact that he said something about it in this episode, it just blew me away. It was so hilarious. It blew me away. But there are also other like OMGs, Easter eggs that come out in episode 9, but that's the big one. But some other ones are, there is a ship in the fleet that is called the USS Pulaski. Easter egg for TNG, because as we know, Beverly Crusher wasn't the doctor the whole time on TNG. There was one season where there was another doctor that came on, and that was Dr. Pulaski. I think that's cool that they name a ship after her. I really liked Dr. Pulaski. I'm not going to say I didn't like Beverly Crusher as a doctor. I did like Beverly Crusher as a doctor, but she had some really nebulous kind of episode moments. There were a few episodes, and a lot of those centered around her relationships with guys. she just wasn't good in that area. And maybe that's why she went away when she realized that she was going to have Jack Crusher. Maybe that's why. I don't know. But we talk about that extensively on our regular episodes. You got to hear that. We talk about this on the regular episode, but I'm going to mention here because it's a little Easter egg, is that the admiral that is kind of hosting Frontier Day is Admiral Shelby, Commander Shelby in Star Trek TNG. And she is the commander that comes on board the Enterprise when they engage the Borg, and the whole Wolf 359 incident, and where Picard becomes Locutus. And it spans over 2 episodes. And Commander Shelby is in those 2 episodes. And she's there because when they first met the Borg, which that was Q's doing, the backstory is that when they first met the Borg, Commander Shelby was one of those Starfleet people that was doing everything that she could to try to find weapons against the Borg, to try to arm against the Borg, to try to defeat the Borg. Riker says, and it's funny that Riker is the one that says this because in TNG, Riker and Commander Shelby just butted heads. Yeah, it was bad. But they grew to respect each other after the couple episodes. So it was interesting that Riker was the one that said, out of all the people, this is so ironic that Commander Shelby is endorsing this program on Frontier Day, because this program is basically a Borg designed program. It's basically the way the Borg wanted the fleet, and she's endorsing it. And it's very interesting that she's the one that's doing it. But of course, nobody realizes that the changelings are infiltrating to implement this Borg plan. So it's interesting that she's there and she's the one that's doing that. Also, with episode 9, the young people being assimilated is one of those human condition episodes, which is kind of what we've been talking about. The episode with Darmok, the episodes that we've talked about that kind of explain that human condition and try to put a commentary on a societal problem that we're dealing with in current day. And the young people being assimilated is low key one of those things, without getting too political about it. But if you think about it, the young people being assimilated is speaking to one of our kind of societal issues that we have going on right now, with book banning and other things, which I'll leave that right there. And so when we talk about episode 10, what we see and what we hear in episode 10 are also a few Easter eggs that just give us a little bit of that nostalgia. So first off, the Star Trek graphics that we see with the Borg electric currents, that whole tractor beam kind of thing going on, those are nostalgic for TNG. Data said he feels something in his gut, or he has this gut reaction. And that is one of those human things, of course, he doesn't have, but he talks about that with Geordi in an episode of TNG. And he's like, I feel it in my gut. And it's one of those things that go back to a TNG episode that where he talks about kind of the same thing. And he doesn't feel it in his gut because he doesn't have feelings. He doesn't have that instinct kind of thing. Also in episode 10, we hear Majel Barrett's voice. She is the voice of the computer. She's the actress that was the voice of the computer. She's also the actress that played Lwaxana Troy. And she was also married to Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek. So it was interesting to hear her voice at the end. And I did mention this on on the regular episode that we heard her voice. This is kind of at the very end of the episode. Also, they get around a poker table. That's a big deal for this TNG crew to get around a poker table. And not all of them get around the poker table until the very end of TNG. And at the very end of TNG, they all come around the poker table and Picard comes in and he's one of the ones who hasn't actually played poker with them. And he says in that very last episode of TNG that, I wish I had done this sooner. And he's looking around at everybody. And the fact that that's what they do at the end of this series, the last episode, is cool. Worf folds in poker. That he does that every episode. He's never won a hand. And he folds again here. Basically, and before they have that last scene, Data starts a limerick, and it's the same limerick that he tried to start and on TNG. It's in the episode where he tries to learn how to be funny, and it's an accidental joke with Guinan that he doesn't realize. He also makes a joke on the bridge that he doesn't realize that he made. And so when he realizes that my timing is digital, okay, that's a joke, then he tries to do a limerick. And yeah, and of course they cut him off before he gets to the part that not safe for primetime television. But yeah, they never let him finish that limerick that he wants to finish. So that's funny there too. And we also hear a sonata from Julius Caesar. Shakespeare is really big in TNG. Picard loves to quote Shakespeare. We've seen the cast act out a couple of, especially with Data. Some of the themes of those plays are also themes in the episode. So Shakespeare is big for TNG, and quoting Shakespeare is big for TNG. And so having this Julius Caesar sonnet quoted at the end, that rounds everything out. And of course, at the very end, like almost like an after credit scene, we see Q in the after credit scene. And we talked about that as well on our regular episode. So I'm hoping that you really loved hearing about all of these Easter eggs. There were so many, and as you can see, there's so many that they make up a whole other episode here. And I know there's some of you real Trekkie fans out there that really wanted to know or really just wanted to commiserate with somebody that wanted to nerd out about Star Trek through all the Easter eggs in this. I really feel that with all these Easter eggs in Star Trek Picard, this was a little bit like a love letter to all those Trek fans out there. The ones that go to the conventions, the ones that dress up, the ones that have watched every episode and know exactly what's going on in every episode of TNG from the moment that it comes on to the theme song. That's me. And those that are at Comic Cons and things like that. This is really a love letter to us. And I'm feeling that love, and I'm hoping that you feel that love as well from one Trekkie to another. I hope you enjoyed this episode and look forward, of course, to other Star Trek episodes as, the franchises keep rolling on. And as they keep coming out, we'll keep watching and we'll keep reviewing. So make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Wherever you're seeing this, wherever you're hearing this, make sure you're subscribed because more Star Trek will be to come. While that's the end of our discussion, it's not the end of the story, so to speak. We now have premium episodes, which you can get in your feed, wherever you listen to podcasts, or in your inbox if you listen on nerdyromanticspodcast.com. And if you want to know more about the Nerdy Romantics world, sign up for our newsletter. Visit my website at nerdyromanticspodcast.com for more details. Now that's the end of the story. Until next time, thank you for listening.